Well, Nigel, it certainly has, and to the entire world as well. The impact from coronavirus, as we're seeing now, over 150,000 deaths worldwide, has been staggering. And the economic impact on top of that, as we've seen economies in the United States and Britain and all across the world grind to a virtual halt, that has had massive, massive economic impacts as well. That I think will reverberate for years.
Now, we've obviously had lockdown on this side of the pond, as you have, and thus far we've not seen really any protest, or not much protest against it. But I noticed over the weekend quite a number of people gathering in streets saying we want our freedom, we want our liberty, and it seemed to me that it was happening in states that had Democrat governors. Is there an argument that President Trump is almost supporting these protests?
Well, I think the president has rightly spoken out against government leaders being overzealous. It is one thing to put in place common sense provisions to slow the spread of the virus, to put in place provisions, for example, mandating social distancing and banning large gatherings. Those ideas, particularly where the numbers and scientific data support them, have a sound scientific and public policy basis. It's another thing where you have elected officials really abusing their power. So we've had instances across the United States where in one instance in Colorado, a father playing catch with a 6-year-old daughter, the two of them alone in a park, were put in a police car and threatened with being arrested. We had a woman in Pennsylvania who was driving her car all alone, not with anyone else, driving on the street, and she was ticketed for that. We have had people who have gone to church in their cars in both Tennessee and Mississippi. They were attending church, but they stayed in their cars. They were listening to the pastor over the radio, so they were social distancing. They weren't interacting with anyone else, but the cars were parked together in a parking lot, and all of them got ticketed. You know, that's just abuse of power. That doesn't have a public health purpose. And what you see, well, look, another illustration. Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, threatened, he said, if churches or synagogues met, that they risked being permanently closed. Well, let me tell you, Nigel, no government official in the United States has the authority to permanently close a church or synagogue. It's one thing to have temporary measures on social distancing. It's another thing for the inner authoritarian of government leaders to go after people's individual liberty.
Yeah, okay. Now, I understand that, and we've had similar occasional silly instances have happened here in the UK too. What prospect is there, albeit respecting people's space and having distancing, but, you know, countries like Austria, for example, are now beginning to allow shops that are non-essential to open up. Are there signs of an easing happening in some of the states now?
I think there are. Last week, the president put out guidelines nationally for when to begin opening up. Also last week, my home state of Texas, the governor put out guidelines. And I do think there's a balance that we've got to respect here, that we need to be smart, we need to follow the science and stop this pandemic. But we also need to recognize that halting the entire economy and putting in place policies that end up costing tens of millions of people their job and pushing them into poverty, that has a real public health consequence as well. That if we continue down the road of destroying people's jobs and livelihoods and small businesses and savings, that is going to result predictably in more loss of human life. That when you inflict that kind of crushing poverty, you know that following up, you're going to see increased rates of mental illness, increased rates of depression. You're going to see higher rates of suicide, higher rates of substance abuse, alcohol abuse. And so I think a great many of us believe we need to weigh both sides of that ledger. We need to be smart on the pandemic and combating it, but at the same time, we need to recognize that shutting things down for too long or being too extreme about it will have a very serious cost in terms of human lives. And so we've got to pursue both.
Now, obviously, President Trump, like Boris Johnson, facing these big decisions. There's an election due in November. Is the election actually going to happen? And if it does, how does President Trump so far emerge from this crisis?
Well, I feel confident the election will happen in November, and we will go forward. And right now, I believe that President Trump's likely to be reelected. But it's a volatile situation, and I do think the situation with the coronavirus adds an enormous amount of uncertainty. If we get to November and we have substantially contained this pandemic, we have successfully flattened the curve, the healthcare system has not been overwhelmed like tragically we saw it occur in Italy and elsewhere. And if we see the economy starting to come back, if we see small businesses opening their doors, customers coming back, and a sense of hope and optimism growing, then I think the president could be reelected resoundingly. In fact, I think you could see not only a Republican Senate as we have now, but also a Republican House. On the other hand, if the next 6 months go poorly, if the death numbers continue to climb and climb even more rapidly, if the economy takes a turn even for the worse and we end up with 20, 25, 30% unemployment levels, which are levels this country hasn't seen since the Great Depression, we're in uncharted territory there. And it is certainly possible in an election like that that the American people vote out President Trump and vote for the Democrats. And I think that would have really significant public policy consequences. But I think how this election turns out depends very much on the resolution of this crisis that we're in the midst of.
Now, one thing I know, Ted, that you're concerned about is the role of China in all of this in terms of where this virus came from, how it came to us. And I understand you're looking to put a piece of legislation before the US Senate.
That's correct. I've introduced legislation that would sanction Chinese officials for censoring not only political speech, but truthful speech about a medical crisis. If you look at this coronavirus pandemic and the enormous toll that it has inflicted, China bears a massive responsibility, a massive culpability. Number one, it is entirely possible that this virus originated in a lab owned and controlled by the Chinese government. We know that there were 2 laboratories in Wuhan within miles of where the outbreak began, both of which were studying coronaviruses in bats. There had been serious questions raised, including in multiple U.S. State Department wires before the pandemic, about the shoddy security protocols at those labs and about the risk that because of those poor protocols, a pandemic could result. We don't have it confirmed that is in fact the origin of this outbreak, but the Chinese Communist government consistently refuses to answer the question whether either or both of those labs was studying the novel coronavirus, the virus that has caused this global pandemic. Secondly, we know for a fact China actively covered up this outbreak when it occurred. That when the first people began to get sick, and you had heroic physician whistleblowers who stood up to speak the truth, who stood up to draw attention to it, the Chinese government came down on them, they silenced them, they prosecuted them, they did everything they could to hide the outbreak because it was perceived to be an embarrassment to the Chinese Communist government. And had they behaved like any responsible government, had they come in with health professionals, had they quarantined those affected, there's a very real possibility this could have been contained as a regional outbreak rather than becoming a global pandemic. And the loss of life in the UK, in Europe, in the United States, the misery, the suffering, the economic damage, all of that could have been avoided if China had not actively engaged in a cover-up. And so we know that they bear active responsibility, and I think there's going to be a real accounting worldwide as to the responsibility of the Chinese Communist government for this tragedy that has unfolded.
Okay, Senator Cruz, thank you very much for joining us here on LBC.
We will make America great again.